mean to be free? Big question. What does it mean to be free? When we think of freedom, one of the first things that we think of is political freedom. We often think about freedom as it exists to a political category. Obviously, this is a significant way in which we think about freedom, and the word freedom first hits us. The idea of freedom or liberty being freedom from oppressors or an oppressive authority or overreaching authority. The utilitarian British philosopher John Stuart Mill, in his famous essay on liberty, on the way to his longer discussion, sets this up as the primary way in which we think about freedom or liberty, in this political lens from oppressive authorities. This is what he writes at the beginning of On Liberty. He says, "The struggle between liberty and authority is the most conspicuous feature in the portions of history with which we are earliest familiar. By liberty was meant protection against the tyranny of the political rulers." He goes on to say, "The aim, therefore, of patriots was to set limits to the power which the ruler should be suffered to exercise over the community, and this limitation was what they meant by liberty." Obviously, we think about this when we think about freedom. The idea that freedom is freedom in a political dimension where there's a delicate balance between the exercise of authority and our own ability to be free and live free lives. But we know that the idea of freedom, in the category of freedom, is not exhausted by just the political dimension. Because even when we have political freedom or are moving towards political freedom, we still think about other areas of our life in which we are either free or not free. In 2021, Norwegian Cruise Lines ran a series of ads trying to get people to get back out and travel after the horrendous first year of COVID. And the ad campaign was called Break Free. And they had all these shots of people doing travel-y things, they're clinking wine glasses and coming up for air from under the water and doing all these things. And underneath was Queen's "I Want to Break Free." Did you hear this? Right? The whole idea was you had some situation in your life that you needed to break free from. And so freedom looks like a situational freedom that you could achieve through travel. And travel ideally through Norwegian Cruise Lines. Maybe not we're getting a plug, but that's pretty good. Now, it's actually interesting and ironic because they only play one part of that Queen song in the ad over and over again. "I want to break free." Because actually, the rest of the song doesn't really fit with the particular kind of freedom, situational freedom that they're sort of looking at, right? The lines from the first verse of Queen's Break Free are, "I want to break free, I want to break free, I want to break free from your lies. You're so self-satisfied, I don't need you. I've got to break free. God knows I want to break free," right? And it would be sort of weird in that cruise line ad if they had someone like running on the beach. And all of a sudden they're just like, "You're so self-satisfied." You'd be like, that cruise is for people who are having very different experiences. They have a very specific target market with their. But of course, that reveals another dimension within which we look for freedom, relational freedom. Because it's kind of a painful aspect of human existence that we can live in relationships with other people that make us feel like we're not free because of a relational pattern, or authority pattern, or communication pattern. And so there are all sorts of different dimensions to the way we think about freedom. Political freedom, situational freedom, relational freedom. All of these things we're singing and thinking and talking and writing about freedom all the time because we recognize that there's something really, really important implicit in the question of freedom, namely that there's a high cost of not being free. The cost of not being free is very, very high. And so we're singing and thinking and writing and dancing and all sorts of things about freedom all the time because there's such a high cost if we don't have freedom in our lives. And it's actually not just the cost of the pain of sitting under some coercive authority, which is a painful cost in and of itself, but it's actually the even more devastating cost of maybe not becoming who I was meant to be. Maybe not ever becoming myself as God created me to be. Not myself in relationship to all these other voices and all these other forces and all these other agendas, but me as I recognize myself before God. And that can't happen without freedom. And so we ask ourselves the question in our souls over and over again. Is there any reason to think that I might actually one day be truly free? This is the question we're going to be asking today. We're walking through an exegetical sermon series through the letter of Galatians. It's been a wonderful time. We've just been going verse by verse through the text of Galatians. Today we're going to be in Galatians chapter 5, verses 13 to 15. If you are just jumping into the text of Galatians and don't know all the context and stuff, there are all sorts of sermons up online from chapters 1 and 2 that set a little bit more of the stage, and you can download those from our website. All you need to know today is that the letter to the Galatians was written by the Apostle Paul in the first century to Christians who were living in the Roman province of Galatia, which is modern-day Turkey. And they had come under the influence of a teaching that had told them that in order to live a right life before God and other people, they had to get a whole bunch of things right. That their life had to be structured in patterns of sort of religious and cultural observances that actually kept them bound up in a certain way before God and other people. And Paul thinks that this teaching is so antithetical to the good news of the gospel and the freedom of Jesus Christ that he's writing to them a strongly worded letter trying to move them out from under the influence of this teaching. Again, our text today is Galatians chapter 5, verses 13 to 15. I'll read the text aloud. For you are called to freedom, brothers. Only do not use your freedom as an opportunity for the flesh, but through love serve one another. For the whole law is fulfilled in one word: you shall love your neighbor as yourself. But if you bite and devour one another, watch out that you are not consumed by one another. Not all forms of freedom are truly free. Not all forms of freedom are truly free. Paul begins here in Galatians chapter 5, verse 13, distinguishing between different types of freedom. This is obscured a little bit by the ESV's translation when it says, only do not use your freedom as an opportunity for the flesh. That translation makes it sound like Paul's distinguishing between instrumentality of freedom. In other words, the idea that you have freedom and then you can use it in certain ways. And maybe that's happening here, but a more wooden reading of the Greek here would suggest something else, because there's actually no word for use in the Greek in this passage. The Greek literally, one literal translation, renders this Greek passage this way. For you, brothers, were called to freedom, but not the freedom for opportunities of the flesh. Rather, serve one another in love. Do you see the difference there? This translation makes it sound like what Paul is doing is not distinguishing between uses of one freedom, but actually distinguishing between different kinds of freedom through which the word "the" is leaned upon heavily to make that distinction. Right? Paul is saying, you're called to freedom, this kind of freedom, not to the freedom that serves an opportunity to the flesh. And the word "the" exerts such power here, distinguishing not between use, but between kinds of freedom that the Galatians can be participating in. The importance and weight and drama of the presence of the word the definite article, has recently been brought back to our culture's attention through the cultural phenomena known as corn kid. If you don't know what corn kid is, let me give you a little background. Corn kid is a kid who once upon a time didn't like corn. But when he tried it with butter, everything changed. Now, corn kid knows way more about corn than I do. You can ask him, he'll tell you all about it. And corn kid's sayings about corn have been rapidly collected and put into a song. And these are the words from this song. Oh my gosh. Corn kid's song. It's corn, a big lump of mouse. It has the juice. I can't imagine a more beautiful thing. It's corn, I can tell you all about it. I mean, look at this thing. When I tried it with butter, everything changed. And the point that I want to draw your attention to today is this beautiful line. It has the juice. The power of the word "the." It has the juice, because it doesn't say it full of juice. It doesn't say it's juicy. He says it has the juice, distinguishing that juice from many other forms of juice. We look at this and we go, Corky, tell me what you know. What do you know about this juice that makes it worth distinguishing from all other different types of juice that's present in corn? And the same force of the word "the" is present in Paul's use when he says, but not for the freedom. The same power of distinction that makes you stop and go, I didn't know I should have paid attention here. I didn't know I should have paid attention to different kinds of freedom. I didn't know I should have paid attention to different kinds of juice that can make corn such a delightful experience. I didn't know. But Paul says there are different kinds of freedom. And you're called to some, and you're not called to others. There's a false freedom, Paul says, that is described by the idea that it serves opportunities in the flesh. Opportunities in the flesh. The language here in verse 13, not freedom that serves the opportunities of the flesh, is getting at the idea that there is a way of being free that is simply a raw openness to any desire or idea or impulse or opportunity that comes my way. It's a freedom of total openness to anything and everything. Now, of course, this kind of freedom is very important. And for some people in certain situations, it's a very important kind of freedom to establish. Because, of course, if you find yourself in a relationship with a coercive or abusive authority system or person, the idea that you would be able to step into a kind of freedom that's like, I'm free from all of that, is very important. But the problem, Paul says, this is why he calls it opportunities in the flesh, is that when we stay in that kind of freedom over and over again, over time, we enter into a new kind of prison and a new kind of limitation, where we are so open to being bombarded by anything, any desire, any impulse, any idea, any opportunity, that we actually are not able to narrow ourselves and pursue something that's good. And so the freedom that is just radical openness to anything, over time, if it doesn't grow into something else, begins trapping us into a prison of, I have all these opportunities in front of me. And freedom looks like just remaining open to everything all the time. This doesn't just trap ourselves. This ends up inevitably harming other people. Because when our lives are governed by the pursuit, whatever impulse or opportunity I want to pursue right now, and that's what it looks like for me to be free, inevitably other people become stepping stones to the next thing that I pursue. The desires of the flesh and pursuing them need to be fed by flesh. They're fed by people. This is why Paul says in verse 15, but if you bite and devour one another, watch how that you're not consumed by one another. Paul says there's a kind of freedom that just leads us to taking bites out of other people, and other people taking bites out of us, where we just look around and see other people in the world as opportunities through which I can pursue this new thing that I have to achieve or solve or get or manufacture right now. This entire idea of this kind of freedom could be summed up in the words freedom from. It's freedom from that Paul says is a freedom that is governed by opportunities in the flesh. Freedom from. And of course, again, freedom from is a necessary and valuable step on the way to true freedom. Because if you are sitting under some coercion or some abuse of authority, you need, in order to be free, to be able to say, I'm free from that. I have distance from that. But if that's all we have, if all we have is an understanding of what it means to be free, that's freedom from coercion, we're never able to marshal ourselves into the pursuit of things that we actually think are good in our lives and to pursue them in a long enough way that they come to fruition in our lives. Freedom from is a necessary step, but it stops short. It cannot put us into a place of faithful endurance with the things that are really valuable about life over time. For that, we don't need freedom from. we need freedom for. Freedom from wants to grow into freedom for. But paradoxically, freedom for is necessarily limited. Freedom for something that is good is when we see something that's good or lovable and we want it so badly that we use our freedom to narrow the scope of our freedom around this one valuable thing. Do you see what I'm saying? Freedom for something is actually freedom to accept the limits that are necessary in order to pursue this one thing over time. Think, for example, about a marriage. What kind of freedom is necessary for a flourishing marriage? I'm married. It would be a totally ridiculous understanding of what marriage is to say, well, I got married, now I'm not free anymore. I'm not free because there are all these relational avenues that are no longer open to me. And if someone were to look at me in my marriage and say, oh my gosh, you've been in prison once you limited yourself to one person, I would say, you are reading my marriage through freedom from, but my marriage is built on freedom for. There are certain things in the world that can only be built on freedom for. I'm free to limit myself in a relationship to one person. And because freedom can be expressed in that way, certain good things can come about that otherwise would not be possible to produce. Like, I don't know, love. Because what does love require? Love requires faithfulness and endurance over time. Love requires the ability to say no to other things so you can say yes to something that's lovable. And this isn't just in a marital relationship. This isn't anything that would be an object and mutual subject of our desire and love. Anything that we could say, I love doing that. I love that thing. I love that person. Anything that we could marshal and say it's worthy of the word love to be described. It takes freedom for that object of love. Not freedom from, that runs in and is like, I don't know, this is cool. That thing came over there. I'm going over there. Love requires freedom from. Freedom for, or, I said that wrong. Love requires freedom for. Freedom from asks the question, what do I need to do to satisfy my latest impulse? But freedom for asks the question, what does love require of me? And how can I use my freedom to come in alignment with that love? Paul says to the Galatians that this is what the law has been pointing to all along. This is what God's been trying to do in the law. He's been trying to show people a way in which their freedom can be marshaled towards love and the love of another person. That's why Paul says in Galatians chapter 5, verse 14, he says, for the whole law is fulfilled in one word, you shall love your neighbor. You'll love them. And again in verse 13, not the freedom that's an opportunity for the flesh, but freedom through love to serve one another. God says freedom should result in the self-limiting that's necessary to love something and to love someone else. And when we think about that and just hear about it, I think most of us are like, yeah, cool, great. I would love to experience love. I would love to love another person. I would love to pursue devotion in my life with the characteristic of love. And I would love to do that in a way that is faithful endurance such that it can be grown over time. And so sure, I'll let go of freedom from. I can see how that's helpful along the way, but it's not a place to stay and live. I'm going to grow in to freedom for. I'm going to love other people and love my work and love. But there's a catch. Verse 14 reads, for the whole law is fulfilled in one word, you shall love your neighbor as yourself. Now that's really interesting. You shall love your neighbor as yourself. We often read that as like a sort of expression of the golden rule, right? Like, treat others the way you want to be treated. And that's great. It's a wonderful rule. If you're ever in a situation and you're not sure of a rule to apply, or how you do that, just grab the golden rule. I mean, you could do a lot worse. But what if it's actually not talking about like a moral thing that we wish that like we just repeat to other people because we want them to be nice to us? What if it's actually saying, in the way in which you love yourself, you will then be able to love other people? What if that's actually what that's saying? And when I say love yourself, I'm not saying gross, obsessive narcissism. I'm saying that in the way in which you understand yourself with a gentle, contented, satisfied posture, knowing that I'm made well and I'm lovable. That to the extent that you live in that place, that is the place out from which you'll be able to help other people live. What if that's what this verse is saying? When it says you'll love your neighbor just like you love yourself. I think we actually would find it to be true in our lives, wouldn't we? Because the reality is, for so many of us, it's really hard to love ourselves. Right? I mean, it's really easy to look at our age and the world that we live in and all of the producing that happens and think we live in an age of self-obsession. I just think that's a surface level thing. Might it not be more true that we live in an age of self-loathing? Where people are just running away from themselves all the time. Running away from their failures, running away from where they grew up, running away from those people they knew, running away from all the things that I don't like about myself, running away from how I look, running away from how I've done poorly in my job, running away from all the affirmation, and just running away and running away and running away. In an age where people actually just aren't able to sit down with themselves and say, there might be something in here that's good. And doesn't actually that describe a lot of the way we think about ourselves? Because how often, when we think about ourselves, do we say, you know what? Whatever else there is to be said about me, I've been through what I've been through, and I'm here. I'm standing. And my life hasn't been totally burned to the ground. And I haven't burned other people's lives to the ground. And maybe that's just one place from which I can say, there's something good going on in here. Isn't it exceedingly rare that that voice ever shoots through our minds? Don't we say instead, God, I really don't like myself. God, I wish I had that person's story. God, I wish I were from where that person is. God, I wish I had achieved what that person did. And we just cannot find anything to say about ourselves other than something that says, I don't like me. And then what on earth do we have to give to other people out of that place? Nothing. Nothing. I mean, other people come to us and they're like, I need something. And we're like, I really wish I had something to give you. I want to give you something. I really do, but I barely have anything for me. I barely have anything that makes me able to sit down in the quiet of my soul and say, something good happened here, and it's worth loving. What if we're not ever able to enter into freedom unless we were able to first find a way to enter into freedom for ourselves? Freedom to love ourselves. Freedom to feel like I am lovable. And there's a reason to think that whatever else hasn't happened in my life and whatever else has gone wrong, that something here is valuable and worth loving. All the world has to offer us in that regard is freedom from. The world looks at our lives and goes, yeah, it's a real bummer that you are who you are. Maybe if you had freedom from some of those things in your life. Maybe if you had freedom from some of the things that went wrong. Maybe if you had freedom from. Maybe if you were free from you and you could just be somebody else. Maybe if you were free from who you are. Then you have the life you want. And we've tried to be free from the parts of ourselves that we don't like. We've tried to leave them behind. That pattern of behavior that keeps ruining my relationships, we really tried. Or this memory and experience that I have that just haunts me over and over again. I've tried to be free from it, and I can't let it go. And so we just look and look from place to place, relationships, experiences in our bodies, things we can buy, our work. We're looking for anything that will free us from ourselves and say, here's this new you. And we're just looking and looking and looking in the world, saying, if only I could be free from that, maybe I would be free for myself in some way. To recognize that there's something basically good and lovable here, out from which I can give love to other people. And we're just looking all over for it in the world, and it's not there. We haven't found it. We've turned over every rock. We've put every key into every lock, and it's not to be found in the world, but it can be found in God. In God it can be found. Hallelujah. Freedom for yourself can be found. Because God is free for you, so you can be free for you too. God, in God's nature, in His being, He's free from everything. He's utterly free from outside influence, from coercion, from manipulation. God could not be more open to any possibility that God would ever want. And yet God used that freedom to focus it and channel it into the person of Jesus Christ, that you might know in a focused and personal way that you are loved. God moved from freedom from to freedom for in His being, so that you might know if there's someone who's free for you and limited himself for you, that you can be free to love yourself too. This is what Paul writes in Philippians chapter 2, verses 6 through 8, this exact dynamic. Christ Jesus, though He was in the form of God, did not count equality with God a thing to be grasped, but made Himself nothing, taking the form of a servant, being born in the likeness of men. And being found in human form, He humbled Himself by becoming obedient to the point of death, even death on the cross. That a being who is in the form of God, open to satisfying any possibility He wants at any time, would for love of you focus that freedom into a body, into a person, into an act of freeing demonstration of His love for you on the cross. If God is free for you in that way, then that answers the question of, is there any way I can be free for me? Free to love me in the particularities of my existence. Not if I was born over there, if I would have had that opportunity, if I would have been friends with those people or gotten that job, or not any of those things, about all of the tyranny of the how could my life have gone and how would I have been better than somebody else. God comes into that and says, in the particularity of who you are, that's who I met in Jesus. Right now, as you are, that person, that's who I died for. They're lovable. They've been pronounced as lovable for all time. And so you can love yourself too. Not yourself as you wished you were. Not yourself as that other person said you should be. But the person that God became flesh to die for. The person who's sitting in this chair right now. That person. And when we receive that love from God, we become free for ourselves in our own lives. Not running away from ourselves in the life that we feel like we need to curate or have over there, but freedom to then begin to grow up in who we actually are. How long has it been since we just sat with ourselves and said, wherever this is going, it's going to be good. God did a good job. And as I live in a free relationship with God, I trust that God's going to do something good. What would you do if you had that kind of freedom? What kind of power would that put into your life? It comes from God. Because God sees you that way. Amen. This is what Paul invites the Galatians into. Freedom from focusing into freedom for when they respond to a call. That's how it happens. That's how general freedom becomes specific freedom. When we hear a call of some love and we respond and focus around it. Freedom from focuses into freedom for when it responds to a call. That's what Paul says to the Galatians right at the beginning of the passage. Do you remember? For you were called to freedom. You were called. Something happened where you stopped and God's voice met you and came to you and called you. And from that place you said, I don't know everything about where that call is going, but I'm going to begin to focus my freedom in response to that voice. And the only reason that they would respond to that voice is gracious and merciful and loving and kind. And they heard that voice, and we hear that voice through our encounter with God. And all we have to do now is respond to it. Exchanging that freedom is just a matter of response. It's a wild thing. It isn't something we have to try all that hard to do. It's been the hardest thing to do and the least difficult thing to do ever. Just saying, God, you've called me. By saying, you love me, and I'm responding to your love. And that actually is a key that unlocks me from the prison of myself, where I'm not free to become who you made me to be. We respond to God's call when his voice comes to us. It's that simple. We just respond.